The fluorescent lights of Pine Valley's only 24-hour diner cast harsh shadows across Grace Mitchell's face as she wiped down tables for the third time that evening. At 39, her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that survival meant never stopping, never resting, never allowing hope to creep too close to her heart. The clock above the coffee machine read 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, she could lock up, drive home to her cramped two-bedroom apartment, and maybe catch 4 hours of sleep before her morning shift at the elementary school cafeteria began. Annie and Ben would already be asleep, their small bodies curled together on the pull-out couch that served as their bedroom, homework scattered across the coffee table like fallen leaves. 3 years. 3 years since she'd walked away from David with nothing but two sleepy 8-year-olds and a suitcase full of clothes that smelled like fear and desperation. 3 years since his family's lawyers had systematically stripped away everything she'd thought was hers: the house, the savings account, even the car she'd driven to their wedding 12 years earlier. Mrs. Mitchell was never a legal owner of any marital assets, the lawyer had said, his voice flat and professional as he destroyed her life with paperwork. All properties and accounts were established in Mr. Mitchell's name prior to the marriage, with specific prenuptial agreements protecting family assets. She hadn't even remembered signing a prenuptial agreement, but then there were a lot of things from those early years she couldn't remember clearly. David had been so charming, so persuasive, so skilled at making her feel cherished right up until the moment she became his possession instead of his partner. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Grace looked up to see Sheriff Martinez stepping inside, shaking rain from his coat. "Coffee, Maria?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Just a quick cup. Rough night out there." He settled onto a stool at the counter, his kind eyes studying her face. "You look tired, Grace. More tired than usual." She poured his coffee and set it down with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just ready to get home to the kids." "You know," he said carefully, "there are resources available. Programs that could help with child care, maybe even housing assistance. You don't have to carry all of this alone." Grace's throat constricted. She'd heard this conversation before, from well-meaning friends, from social workers, from the guidance counselor at Annie and Ben's school. Everyone wanted to help, but help came with forms and questions, and the terrifying possibility that someone might decide she wasn't fit to take care of her own children. "We're managing," she said quietly. "We're doing just fine." Sheriff Martinez nodded, understanding the pride that kept her standing. He left a $5 tip on a $3 cup of coffee and headed back into the rain. Grace was counting the register when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, area code 303. Denver. She almost didn't answer. Bill collectors had gotten creative lately, but something made her swipe the screen. "Miss Mitchell, this is Jonathan Hayes from Hayes, Bradley and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Vincent Morrison." Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, who?" "Vincent Morrison. Our records indicate you're his closest living relative. I've been trying to locate you for several weeks regarding his inheritance." The words seemed to echo in the empty diner. Inheritance. Vincent Morrison. The name tugged at something deep in her memory, like a melody she'd heard long ago, but couldn't quite place. "I think you have the wrong person," she said. "I don't know anyone named Vincent Morrison." "He was your mother's cousin, Miss Mitchell. According to our documentation, he specifically named you as his sole beneficiary. Mr. Morrison passed away 6 months ago, and his estate includes significant real property in Colorado." Grace sank onto one of the counter stools, her legs suddenly unsteady. Her mother had died when Grace was 19, taking with her most of the family history Grace had never thought to ask about. There had been mentions of distant relatives, cousins scattered across the country, but names and faces had blurred together in the haze of grief and David's eager courtship. "What kind of property?" she heard herself ask. A residential estate, quite substantial actually, 63 acres in the Colorado mountains, about 2 hours northwest of Denver. I understand it's been vacant for some time, but the property is legally yours if you're willing to accept the inheritance. Grace closed her eyes, trying to process the words. Property, land. After 3 years of cramped apartments and borrowed furniture, the idea seemed like a fantasy. There are back taxes owed, Mr. Hayes continued, but Mr. Morrison's liquid assets should cover those obligations. Would it be possible for us to meet in person to discuss the details? I I work multiple jobs. I have children. I can't just travel to Denver. Of course, I could drive to Pine Valley if that would be more convenient. Say this Saturday afternoon? Saturday, her one day off from the diner, though she usually spent it doing laundry at the laundromat and grocery shopping with coupons clipped from newspapers other people had thrown away. Okay, she said, surprising herself. Saturday afternoon. After ending the call, Grace sat in the silent diner for a long time, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. At 39, she looked older than her years. The kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix etched into the lines around her eyes. But for the first time in 3 years, something other than fatigue flickered in her chest. Hope was dangerous for someone in her position. Hope meant expectations, and expectations meant disappointment. And disappointment meant explaining to Annie and Ben why their lives would remain small and cramped and limited by circumstances beyond their control. But as she locked up the diner and drove through the empty streets of Pine Valley, Grace allowed herself to imagine what 63 acres might look like. Space for the children to run, a garden where they could grow their own vegetables. Maybe even a dog. Annie had been asking for a dog since she could talk. The apartment was dark when she slipped inside, but she could hear the soft whisper of her children's breathing from the living room. Annie and Ben, 8 years old and already more resilient than anyone should have to be at their age. They'd adapted to the cramped quarters, the hand-me-down clothes, the careful way Grace counted every dollar before spending it. They never complained, never asked why they couldn't have the things their classmates took for granted. Grace stood in the doorway, watching them sleep, their faces peaceful in a way that made her chest ache. They deserved better than this constant struggle, this endless cycle of work and worry, and making do with less than enough. Maybe Vincent Morrison, whoever he was, had given them a chance at something more. Saturday arrived gray and cold, with a kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look older and more tired than it actually was. Grace had arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez next door to watch Annie and Ben, trading babysitting duties with the elderly woman who understood what it meant to make sacrifices for family. Jonathan Hayes turned out to be a thin, precise man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed Grace's family for a month. They met at Rosie's Cafe, the only restaurant in Pine Valley that stayed open on weekends. I brought copies of all the relevant documentation, he said, spreading papers across the small table between them. Birth certificates, property deeds, Mr. Morrison's will. Everything you'll need to understand the scope of the inheritance. Grace stared at the papers, focusing on a property survey that showed boundaries encompassing more land than she had ever imagined owning. Tell me about Vincent Morrison. Why would he leave property to someone he'd never met? Mr. Hayes adjusted his glasses. According to his papers, you had met him, actually, when you were quite young. There are photographs in his personal effects, family gatherings from the late 1990s. You would have been around 14. The memory hit her like cold water. Uncle Vince, the tall, gentle man with sad eyes who had appeared at family functions during those turbulent years when her parents' marriage was disintegrating. He'd been the only adult who seemed to understand that she was drowning in the chaos, who took time to ask about school and listen to her answers. He disappeared, she said suddenly. One day he was just gone. My mother said there had been some kind of falling out. Family dynamics can be complicated, Mr. Hayes said diplomatically. What matters now is that Mr. Morrison never forgot you. His will specifically states that he wanted his property to go to someone who would understand its true value. What's the catch? Grace had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. The property has been vacant for nearly 15 years. No utilities, significant weather damage, likely structural issues. The back taxes amount to almost $11,000. Frankly, Miss Mitchell, you may find that the costs exceed any potential value. Grace's spirits plummeted. Of course there was a catch. There was always a catch. However, Mr. Hayes continued, Mr. Morrison's estate includes sufficient liquid assets to cover the tax obligations and transfer fees. You would inherit the property free and clear of debt. What you choose to do with it afterward is entirely your decision. Free and clear. The words sounded impossible. Grace had spent so many years drowning in debt and obligations, and the constant pressure of never having enough, that the concept of owning something outright seemed like a fairy tale. She signed the papers with hands that shook slightly, accepting responsibility for 63 acres of Colorado mountain country she'd never seen. Mr. Hayes handed her a heavy ring of old brass keys in a manila envelope sealed with red wax. Mr. Morrison left specific instructions that this envelope should only be given to you after you'd legally accepted the inheritance, he said. I have no idea what's inside. The drive to the property took longer than expected. Grace had called in sick to her Saturday cleaning job, a luxury she couldn't afford but somehow couldn't resist. Annie and Ben sat in the back seat of her aging Honda, their faces pressed to the windows as the landscape changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills to dense forest. Are we really going to live in a castle, Mama? Ben asked for the fourth time. It's not a castle, sweetheart. It's just a house. Probably a very old, broken-down house. But it's ours. Annie's voice carried a wonder that made Grace's chest constrict. It's ours. The turnoff came suddenly, marked by a rusted mailbox so weathered the numbers were barely visible. The driveway was more of a suggestion than an actual road. Two tire ruts separated by overgrown grass and encroaching saplings. Grace's Honda scraped and bounced along the path, branches squealing against the sides like fingernails on a chalkboard. They drove through thick forest for what felt like miles before the trees opened up to reveal a clearing that took Grace's breath away. The house rose from the overgrown landscape like something from a Gothic novel, 3 stories of weathered stone and timber, with multiple chimneys reaching toward the cloudy sky and windows that reflected the afternoon light like watchful eyes. Wow, Annie whispered. It was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Ivy covered half the facade, and several windows were broken, their glass catching the light like scattered diamonds. The front entrance was framed by massive stone columns, though one leaned at an angle that suggested structural problems Grace couldn't afford to fix. Can we go inside? Ben was already unbuckling his seatbelt. Grace stared at the mansion, because that's what it was, an actual mansion, and felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what she'd inherited. This wasn't the modest house she'd imagined. This was something that belonged to wealthy people, people who understood how to maintain grand properties and pay for repairs that probably cost more than she made in a year. Okay, she said finally, but stay close to me. We don't know how safe it is inside. The front door was enormous, wooden, carved with intricate patterns that might have been beautiful before weather and time had worn them nearly smooth. Grace tried several keys before finding one that fit the ancient lock. It turned with a sound like grinding bones, and the door swung inward on hinges that screamed. The smell hit them first. Dust and mildew and something else. Something old and stale like breath that had been held too long. The entry hall stretched before them, cavernous and dark, with a chandelier hanging from the ceiling, so covered in cobwebs it looked like a ghost. Annie grabbed Grace's hand. "It's spooky, Mama." "It's just old, baby. Old houses feel spooky until you get used to them." They explored slowly, Grace's phone flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal details that made her breath catch. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved from dark wood. Doors lined the hallway, all closed, hiding rooms that might contain treasures or disasters. The sitting room held furniture covered in sheets that had rotted into lace. A dining room featured a table long enough to seat 20 people. The library contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, most of the books swollen with moisture and falling apart. Every room told the same story: wealth, abandonment, decay. Someone had lived here with money and taste, then left or died, and time had moved in like a squatter. "Mama, look!" Ben called from across the library. Grace followed his voice to find him standing before a stone fireplace, pointing at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. The glass was cracked but not broken, and through it Grace could see a black and white image that made her pulse quicken. It was herself at 13 or 14, standing next to a tall man with gentle eyes and graying hair. Uncle Vince. They were both smiling, and her younger self looked happy in a way Grace had almost forgotten was possible. "That's you, Mama," Annie said with certainty. "Yes," Grace whispered. "That's me with Uncle Vince." The memory came flooding back. A family reunion at her aunt's house in Denver, one of the last gatherings before everything fell apart. Uncle Vince had spent hours talking to her about books and art and places she dreamed of traveling. He'd been the only adult who treated her like a person instead of an inconvenience. "Why did he give us his house?" Ben asked. Grace picked up the photograph, studying the faces captured behind cracked glass. "I think maybe he remembered that I was sad, and he wanted to give us a place where we could be happy." They spent another hour exploring, finding more evidence of the life Vincent Morrison had lived. Paintings on the walls, though most were too damaged by moisture to make out clearly. A kitchen that might have been state-of-the-art in 1950, but now looked like an archaeological dig. Bedrooms with furniture that had collapsed into itself over the years. As they prepared to leave, Grace remembered the sealed envelope Mr. Hayes had given her. She opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper covered in precise handwriting. "My dear Grace, if you're reading this, then you've accepted the property and hopefully forgiven an old man for leaving you such a burden. I know this house must seem impossible. Too big, too broken, too expensive to repair. I know you're probably wondering why I chose to complicate your life this way, but there's something you need to understand. This house holds more than memories, much more. The third floor, the room at the end of the hall, you'll find it locked. Use the brass key marked with the number 7. What you discover there will change everything. I couldn't take it with me, and I couldn't destroy it. So I'm leaving it to you, to family, to someone who might understand what to do with something so precious and so dangerous. Trust very few people, and whatever you do, don't let anyone know what you found until you're ready." Your Uncle Vince. Grace read the letter twice, her chest tightening. The third floor. They hadn't made it that far in their exploration, intimidated by the narrow staircase in the growing darkness. "What does it say?" Annie asked. Grace folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "It says Uncle Vince loved us very much." The drive back to Pine Valley was quiet, both children exhausted by the day's adventure and falling asleep before they reached the main highway. Grace's mind raced as she navigated the mountain roads, Uncle Vince's letter burning like a brand in her pocket. What you discover there will change everything. What could be hidden in a locked room that would change anything? More family photographs, old furniture, documents about the property's history. So precious and so dangerous. Those words sent a chill down her spine. that had nothing to do with the evening air. What had Uncle Vince been hiding, and why had he trusted her with the secret? Grace tucked Annie and Ben into their pull-out bed that night, listening to their whispered excitement about the castle in the mountains. They'd already started making plans, where they'd put their beds, whether they could get a dog, if there was room for a swing set in the enormous yard. "When can we go back, Mama?" Annie asked sleepily. "Soon, baby. We'll go back soon." After the children fell asleep, Grace sat at her tiny kitchen table with Uncle Vince's letter spread before her, the ring of brass keys beside it. Key number 7 was slightly larger than the others, older looking, with intricate scrollwork around the head. She'd always been practical, cautious, someone who avoided risk because she couldn't afford the consequences of failure. But something about Uncle Vince's words called to a part of her she'd thought David had destroyed years ago. The part that believed in possibilities, in hidden treasures, in the idea that life could surprise you in beautiful ways. Grace called in sick to her Sunday morning shift at the elementary school cafeteria, something she'd never done before in 3 years of employment. Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to watch the children again, clearly puzzled by Grace's unusual behavior, but too polite to ask questions. The drive to the Morrison property took less time on her second trip, the roads familiar now, the forest less threatening in the bright morning sunshine. Grace parked in the same spot and approached the mansion with purpose, Uncle Vince's letter clutched in one hand and the brass keys in the other. The house felt different when she was alone. The silence was deeper, more expectant, as if the building itself was waiting to see what she would discover. Grace climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, then found the narrower stairs that led to the third-floor servants' quarters. The hallway was shorter than those on the lower floors, with doors standing open to reveal small rooms with iron bed frames and simple furniture. At the end of the hall, exactly as Uncle Vince had described, was a door that differed from all the others. Heavier, with a lock that looked newer than everything else in the house. Grace tried key number 7 with trembling hands. It slid into the lock perfectly, turning with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. Grace turned on her phone's flashlight and began to climb, testing each step carefully. At the top, another door, this one unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into a room that defied comprehension. The temperature was perfectly controlled, a comfortable 68 degrees in a house that had no electricity. Soft LED lighting illuminated the space automatically as she entered, revealing a preservation system that belonged in a museum, not an abandoned mansion. But it was what the room contained that made Grace's knees buckle. The walls were lined with paintings in ornate frames, drawings under protective glass, sculptures on pedestals. Even with her limited knowledge of art, Grace could see that these weren't reproductions or family portraits. These were masterpieces, paintings that seemed to glow with inner light, sculptures that captured human emotion in bronze and marble, drawings so delicate they looked like captured dreams. Glass cases lined one wall, filled with manuscripts, leather-bound books with pages so old they looked like parchment, documents under archival glass with elaborate seals and signatures. One case held what appeared to be illuminated manuscripts, the kind she'd seen in history books, with gold leaf and illustrations so detailed she could make out individual brushstrokes. Another wall displayed jewelry that belonged in museums, necklaces dripping with diamonds, tiaras that caught the light like captured starlight, a collection of pocket watches, each one a tiny marvel of engineering and artistry. Grace moved through the room in a daze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. In the center of the space sat a jade Buddha, perhaps 3 feet tall, serene on a black marble base. Bronze sculptures that might have been ancient Greek remained positioned on shelves with painted pottery and urns, depicting warriors and gods. This wasn't possible, People didn't have rooms like this hidden in abandoned houses. This was the kind of collection that belonged to billionaires, to museums, to people who understood the true value of art and history and beauty. Grace's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her back against the wall, staring at treasures that shouldn't exist in her world. A filing cabinet in the corner caught her attention, professional grade and fireproof, completely out of place among the antique beauty surrounding it. She crawled over to it on hands and knees, trying key after key until one finally worked. Inside were hanging files meticulously organized, filled with certificates of authenticity from auction houses and museums and galleries she'd heard of even in her limited world. Each document told the story of a piece in this room: purchase dates, provenance records, current estimated values that made Grace's head spin. A Monet purchased in 1987 for $340,000, currently valued at $18 million. A first edition manuscript signed by Shakespeare himself, purchased in 1995 for $500,000, currently valued at $25 million. Grace's hands shook as she flipped through file after file, each one documenting treasures beyond her comprehension. At the back of the drawer, in a folder marked Complete Inventory, she found a typed document dated December 31st, 2018. It listed every item in the room, 127 pieces total, with individual valuations and a single line at the bottom that made Grace's vision blur. Total estimated collection value: $260,000 and $260 million in this room, in Uncle Vince's house, now legally in her house. Grace started laughing, a high, hysterical sound that frightened her when she heard it echo off the walls. This wasn't real. This was a dream, or a breakdown, or some kind of elaborate joke. People like her didn't inherit hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art and artifacts. People like her inherited debt and disappointment and broken appliances that couldn't be fixed. But the laughter died when she found Vincent Morrison's personal journals in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Leather-bound books filled with his careful handwriting, documenting not just his acquisitions, but his fears, his hopes, his growing paranoia about people who wanted what he'd spent his life collecting. March 15, 1995. Growing concerned about the inquiries. Third time this month someone has claimed to represent insurance companies. But I know better. They're still searching for pieces that disappeared during the war. My sources were legitimate. My documentation is complete, but provenance is always questionable with items from that era. June 3, 1998, decided to seal the collection, too dangerous to keep it accessible. Someone broke into the Denver gallery last week while I was out of town. Nothing was taken, but they were looking for something specific. I've installed the vault, the climate controls, the security. No one will find it here. October 27, 2003, learning about some of my earlier purchases. Not all of my dealers were as honest as I believed. 3 pieces in the collection: the Degas sketch, the Ming vase, and the Byzantine manuscript, appeared to have been stolen from Jewish families during the Nazi occupation. I've been trying to trace the rightful owners, but the war scattered so many families. What do I do with artifacts that were legitimately purchased but criminally obtained? Grace's breath caught. Uncle Vince hadn't been completely innocent. He discovered that some of his collection had dark origins, pieces that rightfully belonged to families who'd lost everything during the Holocaust. December 12, 2004. Made contact with the Goldstein family descendants. They're willing to accept the return of their grandmother's jewelry collection, but they want guarantees about other pieces. I've agreed to full transparency. Some dealers are threatening legal action if I spread false accusations. They don't understand. I'm not trying to destroy anyone's reputation. I just want to do what's right. February 15, 2019. I'm getting old and my memory isn't what it was. I've returned 12 pieces to their rightful owners over the years. But there are still questions about others. I found Grace. She's struggling, working multiple jobs, raising those beautiful children alone after escaping an abusive marriage. She doesn't know about the collection, doesn't know about me, but she's family and she's strong. I'm leaving her more than just valuable objects. I'm leaving her the chance to do something meaningful, to take what I've protected and turn it into something that matters. I pray she'll understand that some legacies are worth more than money. Grace closed the journal and sat in the perfect silence, surrounded by centuries of human creativity and Uncle Vince's careful guardianship. He hadn't just left her a burden or a treasure. He left her a choice and a responsibility to continue the work he'd started. She could sell these pieces, live comfortably for the rest of her life, ensure Annie and Ben had everything they needed and more. Or she could honor Uncle Vince's vision, find a way to share this incredible collection with the world while continuing to address the ethical questions surrounding its origins. The choice should have been easy. After years of struggle, after the constant pressure of never having enough, the practical decision was obvious. Sell enough pieces to secure their future and maybe donate a few to museums for the tax benefits. But as Grace looked around the vault, studying paintings that had survived wars and theft and time, she thought about what Annie and Ben had said about living in a castle. What if they could? What if this magnificent house could become something magical? A place where people like her, people who'd never had access to real art and beauty, could experience something extraordinary. Uncle Vince had spent 40 years collecting these treasures and 15 years hiding them. Maybe it was time for them to see the light again, but in a way that honored their true history and ensured they'd never disappear into private hands again. Grace locked the vault carefully and made her way back through the empty house, her mind spinning with possibilities that seemed both impossible and inevitable. She had inherited more than art and artifacts. She had inherited a responsibility, a chance to transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. The drive back to Pine Valley passed in a blur of planning and worry and desperate hope. Grace picked up Annie and Ben from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment. Listening to their chatter about school projects and playground politics, while her thoughts remained fixed on the secret vault and its impossible contents. That night, after the children were asleep, Grace sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, researching art authentication and museum management and the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit foundation. The work was challenging, the learning curve steep, but for the first time in years, Grace felt energized by a challenge instead of defeated by it. She found Vincent Morrison's name mentioned in several articles from the 1980s and 1990s, a respected dealer and collector who had disappeared from the public eye around the time his collection had gone into hiding. There were hints of controversy, suggestions that some of his pieces had unclear provenance related to wartime thefts, but nothing concrete, nothing that couldn't be addressed through proper channels. Grace called in sick again on Monday, then Tuesday. By Wednesday, her supervisor at the elementary school was leaving increasingly irritated voicemails about her unexplained absences. But Grace couldn't focus on serving institutional mashed potatoes when she had $260 million worth of art to protect and a legacy to build. She drove to Denver and met with lawyers who specialize in nonprofit foundations and cultural institutions. She researched security systems and advanced preservation technology and insurance policies for collections of this magnitude. She contacted authentication experts and provenance researchers, building a team of professionals who could help her do this right. The process was expensive, complicated, and terrifying. Grace had to take out loans against the property value just to pay for the initial consultations and legal fees. But slowly, piece by piece, a plan began to emerge. The Morrison Legacy Foundation would be established as a public charitable organization. The mansion would be restored and converted into a museum and cultural center. The collection would be properly authenticated and cataloged, with any pieces of questionable provenance handled through appropriate restitution channels. Admission would be free for local residents and students, with suggested donations for other visitors. It was an ambitious plan, probably impossible for someone with Grace's background and resources. But Uncle Vince had believed she could do it, and for the first time in years, Grace was beginning to believe it too. The first major challenge came sooner than expected. Grace had been careful about security, changing the locks on the mansion and installing a basic alarm system, but word had somehow gotten out about her inheritance. Strangers had been seen asking questions in Pine Valley about the Morrison property, about Grace herself, about whether she'd discovered anything valuable in her uncle's house. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while Grace was helping Annie with her math homework. Unknown number, international country code. Miss Mitchell, my name is Dmitry Volkov. I believe you've recently inherited some property that belonged to Vincent Morrison. Grace's blood chilled. The voice was cultured, polite, with a slight accent she couldn't place, but there was something underneath the courtesy that made her skin crawl. I'm sorry, who is this? An old friend of your uncle's, someone who's been waiting a very long time to discuss certain items in his collection, items that rightfully belong to my clients. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, Miss Mitchell, we both know you've discovered Vincent's little secret, the vault, the preservation system, the collection he spent so many years hiding. My clients are prepared to offer very generous compensation for the return of specific pieces that were inappropriately acquired. Grace's grip tightened on the phone. Mr. Morrison's collection was legally obtained. I have documentation. Documentation can be forged. Provenance can be manipulated. But my clients have long memories and longer reach. I suggest you consider our offer carefully. We wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to those beautiful children of yours. The line went dead. Grace sat frozen for several minutes, staring at her phone, her pulse racing so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Someone knew about the vault. Someone was threatening her children. She called the number back immediately, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. She tried again an hour later, then again before bed. Nothing. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She checked the locks on her apartment door 3 times, made sure the windows were secure, kept her phone within reach in case she needed to call for help. Every sound in the hallway made her chest tighten. Every car door slamming outside made her peer through the curtains. By morning, she'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She couldn't protect the collection or her family from a distance. If people were willing to threaten her children over Uncle Vince's treasures, then the only safe place for all of them was together, at the Morrison property, where she could control the environment and ensure their security. Grace quit all 3 of her jobs via text message, ignoring the angry responses and the implications for her employment history. She withdrew what little money she had in savings, packed everything they owned into her aging Honda, and drove Annie and Ben to their new home in the Colorado mountains. Are we really going to live in the castle? Mama? Annie asked as they pulled up the overgrown driveway. Yes, baby, we're really going to live in the castle. The mansion looked different in the late afternoon light, less gothic and forbidding, more like a grand old dame who'd been waiting patiently for her family to come home. Grace had already arranged for basic utilities to be restored to one wing of the house, creating a livable space while the rest underwent renovation. They spent their first night sleeping on air mattresses in what had once been the mansion's morning room, cooking soup on a camping stove, and telling stories by flashlight. Annie and Ben thought it was the greatest adventure of their lives, and for the first time in months, Grace allowed herself to feel hopeful about their future. The second phone call came 3 days later. While Grace was meeting with contractors about the museum renovation, this time Volkov didn't bother with pleasantries. Miss Mitchell, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. My clients simply want what belongs to them. 15 specific pieces from your uncle's collection, and everyone can go back to their normal lives. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid you'll discover just how isolated that beautiful property of yours really is. How long do you think it would take the local sheriff to respond to a call from your location? 20 minutes? 30? Grace's blood turned to ice. He was right. The mansion was miles from the nearest neighbor, hidden in forests that could conceal any number of threats. She'd been so focused on protecting the collection that she'd made herself and the children sitting targets. "I need time to consider your offer," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You have 48 hours. After that, my clients will take more direct action to recover their property." This time, Grace was ready when the line went dead. She'd been recording the call on a second phone, capturing Volkov's threats as evidence. She immediately contacted the FBI field office in Denver, reporting the extortion attempts and requesting federal protection for cultural artifacts that had potentially been stolen during World War II. The response was swift and reassuring. Special Agent Sarah Liu arrived at the Morrison property within 6 hours, accompanied by art crime specialists and a security team that transformed the mansion into a fortress practically overnight. "Your uncle made some powerful enemies," Agent Liu explained as they walked through the vault, her team photographing and cataloging every piece. "Volkov represents a network of collectors and criminals who've been tracking this collection for decades. Some of these pieces disappeared from Jewish families during the Nazi occupation of Europe. Others were stolen from museums and private collections in more recent years." "So Uncle Vince was involved in art theft?" "No evidence suggests that. From what we can determine, your uncle acquired these pieces through legitimate channels, but he became increasingly concerned about their true provenance as he learned more about their histories. Instead of selling them, which might have put them back into the hands of criminals, he chose to preserve them until a proper solution could be found." Agent Liu picked up a small bronze sculpture, studying the authentication documents attached to its base. "Your uncle was essentially acting as an unofficial guardian, protecting cultural artifacts that might otherwise have been lost forever. The question now is what you want to do with that responsibility." Grace looked around the vault, seeing the collection through new eyes. These weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of human history, cultural treasures that had survived wars and theft, and the greed of people like Volkov. Uncle Vince had spent 15 years hiding them, protecting them, waiting for someone who could find a better solution. "I want to create a public museum," Grace said firmly. "I want to work with international authorities to return pieces to their rightful owners when possible and display the others where they can be studied and appreciated by everyone." "That's going to make you a target. People like Volkov don't give up easily." "Then I guess we'll have to be stronger than they are." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived in a rental car, her silver hair pulled back in a professional bun, her dark eyes studying the mansion with interest that seemed both personal and academic. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the International Art Recovery Foundation. Agent Liu contacted me about your situation." Grace invited her inside, noting the way Elena's gaze lingered on architectural details. The careful way she examined the family photographs Grace had found and displayed. "You knew Uncle Vince," Grace said. It wasn't a question. Elena's expression softened. "Your uncle was complicated. He made some questionable purchases in his early career before he understood the full implications of buying art with unclear wartime provenance. But once he learned the truth, he spent the rest of his life trying to make things right." "How do you know all this?" "Because my late husband, Carlos, was Vincent's research partner in the 1990s. They worked together to trace the origins of disputed pieces, to locate surviving family members, to ensure that stolen artifacts found their way back to their rightful owners." Grace felt the pieces of Uncle Vince's story clicking into place. "What happened to your husband?" Elena's voice grew quiet. "He died in a car accident in 1999, shortly after they'd successfully returned a collection of stolen manuscripts to a family in France. The accident was suspicious. Carlos had been receiving threats from dealers who didn't want their business practices exposed. And you've been continuing his work? I've been hunting the people who killed him. Men like Volkov, who trade in the stolen culture and eliminate anyone who threatens their profits. When Agent Liu told me about your situation, about the collection you'd inherited, I knew I had to help. This isn't just about protecting art. It's about finishing what Carlos and Vincent started. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Grace was in the mansion's future gift shop, reviewing architectural plans with contractors, when Agent Liu's radio crackled with urgent voices. Multiple vehicles approaching the main road. Armed individuals, at least 6. Grace's pulse hammered as Agent Liu grabbed her arm. Security protocol now. You and the children to the safe room. They'd prepared for this possibility, converting the mansion's old bomb shelter into a secure panic room with independent communications and supplies. Grace ran through the house calling for Annie and Ben, finding them in the library where they'd been helping sort books for the museum's research collection. Mama, what's wrong? Ben asked as she hustled them toward the hidden entrance to the shelter. Just a precaution, sweetheart. Some bad people want to take Uncle Vince's collection, but we're not going to let them. From the safe room's monitors, Grace watched black SUVs surround the mansion. Men in expensive suits emerged carrying weapons that definitely weren't legal for civilian ownership. Volkov stepped out of the lead vehicle like a general surveying a battlefield, his cold eyes studying the mansion's defenses. Agent Liu's voice came through the shelter's communication system. Stay down. Do not emerge until I give the all clear. The assault was brief but intense. Volkov's men tried to breach the mansion through multiple entry points, but they'd underestimated the FBI's preparation. Federal agents had been positioned throughout the property, turning the mansion into a carefully planned trap. Within an hour, it was over. Volkov and 4 of his associates were in custody, while the others had fled into the forest where additional agents were tracking them down. The collection was safe, the mansion was secure, and Grace's children had slept through most of the excitement in the shelter's comfortable bunks. Is it over? Grace asked Agent Liu as they emerged from the safe room. This phase is over. Volkov will be facing federal charges for extortion, conspiracy, and attempted theft of cultural artifacts. But his network is international, and there are others who know about the collection now. Grace nodded, understanding. She'd crossed a line when she chose to protect Uncle Vince's legacy instead of quietly selling it off. There was no going back to the simple life she'd once known. But as she stood in the mansion's grand entrance hall, watching Annie and Ben excitedly question the FBI agents about their equipment and procedures, Grace realized she didn't want to go back. This was their life now, complicated, occasionally dangerous, but rich with purpose and possibility. That night, after the FBI had finished their investigation, and Elena had helped Grace begin the process of authenticating and researching the collection's full provenance, Grace found Annie and Ben in the library, quietly looking through one of Vincent's old photo albums. Mama, Annie said softly, we found pictures of you when you were little with Uncle Vince. You looked happy. Grace sat beside her children, studying photos she'd forgotten existed. Herself at 12, 13, 14, always smiling when Uncle Vince was nearby. He made me feel safe, she said, just like I want to make you feel safe. We do feel safe, Mama, Ben said, and proud. We're proud that our mama protects beautiful things for everyone. Grace hugged them both, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in her chest. She was protecting beautiful things, not just for her family, but for everyone who would come after them. The Morrison Legacy Foundation officially opened 3 years later, on a crisp October morning that painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Grace stood before the mansion's restored facade, watching visitors stream through the front doors that had once admitted only secrets and sadness. The transformation had been remarkable. The mansion's grand rooms now house carefully curated exhibitions that told the stories of the artists and cultures represented in Uncle Vince's collection. Interactive displays helped visitors understand the historical context of each piece, while state-of-the-art security systems ensured their protection. 7 pieces from the collection had been returned to their rightful owners after extensive provenance research, emotional ceremonies that had brought closure to families who thought their heritage was lost forever. The remaining artifacts were displayed with full documentation of their histories, including Uncle Vince's role in preserving them during the dangerous decades when they might have disappeared into private hands. Grace had discovered talents she'd never known she possessed. Managing contractors, negotiating with insurance companies, coordinating with international museums and cultural organizations. Skills that had been dormant during her years as David's wife were now essential to her daily work as the foundation's executive director. Annie and Ben, now 11 years old, had adapted to their unusual childhood with the resilience that had always marked their characters. They served as unofficial junior docents, greeting visitors and sharing stories about Uncle Vince's treasures with enthusiasm that charmed even the most sophisticated art critics. The foundation was financially stable, supported by admission fees, private donations, and grants from cultural organizations around the world. Grace drew a modest salary, enough to support her family comfortably without being extravagant, and lived in the renovated wing of the mansion that had become their permanent home. She learned to balance the demands of running a cultural institution with the needs of raising her children, creating a life that was both purposeful and grounded in family love. The Morrison Legacy Foundation employed 15 full-time staff members, most of them local residents who'd found meaningful work in their own community. As Grace walked through the galleries on opening day, watching visitors experience Uncle Vince's collection for the first time, she felt a deep sense of completion. A small bronze placard near the entrance hall bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Vincent Morrison, who understood that the greatest treasures are those we share." Below that, in smaller text, "The Morrison Legacy Foundation is dedicated to the principle that art and culture belong to all humanity, not just those with the means to purchase them." Grace paused before a painting that had become her favorite, a Monet water lily scene that seemed to capture light itself in brushstrokes that breathed with life. According to Uncle Vince's journals, this had been the first piece in his collection, purchased with his savings when he was barely older than Grace was now. "He would have loved this," said a voice behind her. Grace turned to find Elena, now not just a colleague but one of her closest friends, studying the painting with appreciation. "You really think so?" Grace asked. "Vincent Morrison spent 40 years collecting these pieces and 15 years protecting them, but he always dreamed of sharing them. You've given him what he wanted most, a legacy that will outlive all of us." That evening, after the last visitors had departed and the staff had secured the galleries, Grace sat in the mansion's renovated library with Annie and Ben, reading them the same stories Uncle Vince had shared with her when she was their age. The children were tired but happy, full of pride about their roles in the day's success. "Mama," Annie said sleepily, "do you think Uncle Vince can see us?" Grace looked around the library with its restored shelves full of books available to any visitor who wanted to explore them, and felt Uncle Vince's presence as strongly as if he were sitting in the chair beside her. "I think he can, sweetheart, and I think he's very proud of what we built together." "Are you happy, Mama?" Ben asked, his eyes already closing. Grace considered the question seriously. At 42, she was happier than she'd ever imagined possible. Not because life was easy. Running a cultural institution was demanding work filled with challenges and complications, but because she discovered who she really was when she stopped letting other people define her worth. She was a guardian of treasures, a creator of opportunities, a woman who'd learned that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the courage to build something meaningful with whatever gifts life provided. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Mama's very happy." Outside the library windows, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against a sky full of stars, protecting the Morrison Legacy Foundation and its treasures for another night. Inside the mansion, the collection waited in perfect preservation for tomorrow's visitors, ready to share its beauty and history with anyone curious enough to seek it out. 5 years later, the Morrison Legacy Foundation had become a model for ethical art restitution worldwide. Grace, now 44, had been invited to speak at international conferences about cultural heritage protection. Annie and Ben, 15 years old, were already showing aptitude for art history and museum management. But the greatest measure of success wasn't in awards or recognition. It was in the thousands of visitors who left the foundation with a deeper appreciation for art and history, and in the 6 additional collections that had been donated by families inspired by Grace's example of transparency and public service. Vincent Morrison's dream had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, proving that the greatest legacies are those that inspire others to create legacies of their own. Grace had learned the most important lesson Uncle Vince had to teach, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the beauty you preserved, and the legacy you left for future generations to build upon. The Morrison Legacy Foundation would continue long after Grace was gone, touching lives not yet born, preserving treasures not yet discovered, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones we give away. In the end, Uncle Vince had left Grace exactly what she needed, not just a collection of valuable objects, but the chance to discover what she was capable of becoming when she stopped limiting herself to other people's expectations. And that, Grace thought, as she walked through galleries filled with wonder and purpose, was the most precious inheritance of all.